Hi, and welcome to Random Walks in HR with me, Tim Peffers. And I'd just like to say, surprise to anyone who's a subscriber or follows me on LinkedIn. It has been a while, and I apologize for that. Why has it been a while? Well, I've been very busy working on my master's dissertation for my master's in people analytics. Good news, I passed. Yay! Bad news, I didn't really like what I wrote. And I spent the last couple of months thinking about things and having lots of ideas. And I really want to rewrite my dissertation paper. I just feel at the moment I could just think about it for the next decade, not do anything. So I thought I would put myself out there online and talk about some of the ideas I have, commit to doing 6 videos in 6 weeks that's going to reframe the whole dissertation piece, and hopefully it will make a lot more sense, especially if you guys out there can do me the huge favor of watching and then providing any kind of feedback either in person at various events or reach out to me through LinkedIn. It would be hugely appreciated. So, what was my master's about? It was called People Analytics 0.0, Reimagining People Analytics in a Wicked World. Why 0.0? Bit of tongue in cheek, really, but I feel like something's not right about people analytics, and we need to maybe take a step back to think about some of the assumptions, some of the basics that we've built the whole of people analytics on, because actually, I think if we get the basics right or the foundations right, going forward, it might make a bit more sense. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the mean being meaningless. Essentially, I believe that people analytics was probably pitched and created on an idea, on a concept, on an imaginary thing. And that imaginary thing is economics in HR, right? We do lots of lovely big data projections, modeling. We do things like visual workforce planning. We take economic theory. We say, right, well, we can do attrition modeling, and that's our supply. And we can look at external markets and looking at our demand. And it all makes a lot of logical sense. The problem with economics, especially with HR, is essentially economic modeling tends to cheat, and it tends to assume that essentially everyone is someone called Homo economicus. Okay, Homo economicus is basically a person. They have all the information. They're completely rational. They are motivated by the very same thing, for example, money, and they all behave in the same way. Right now, the problem with this in HR is that anyone who's worked in people analytics or HR knows very well that people are weird, right? If you're not sure about that statement, have a look at the chart and see that there's someone touching it, right? That person's weird. And it's okay because we're all different in our different ways, okay? Everyone's a little weird in their own way. The problem is no one is not weird in totality, right? If you look in your HR systems, you will not find an average employee, right? Your average employee is probably, grade 10. They work in operations. They've been at the company 2.5 years. They're 62% engaged. Their turnover probability is, 12.5%. They are 38 male, and during the last 360 round, they probably gave people fairly vague feedback, right? That person, let's call them norm, they just don't exist. And even if they do exist, in 3 months' time, they will no longer be the norm because their tenure is going to be 2.75 years, right? So this idea of the average employee and using all these models to predict, outliers and understand, high and low performers versus the norm doesn't really make sense because actually person who's just joined the organization is probably not going to be a high performer. Person who's been there for 5 years unlikely to be a low performer, right? So we need to understand the context and understand the individuals and how they decide to do things, how they behave. And this gets back to the whole classic economics versus behavioral economics argument. Essentially, behavioral economics assumes that Homo economicus doesn't exist and tries to understand why people act in certain ways, how people make decisions. There's been huge strides in the last 20 or 30 years in terms of understanding people's motivations, what makes them different, what makes them behave in non-standard, non-logical ways. So, how does this relate to people analytics? Excellent question posed by me. Well, here's one of my pitches in terms of how we need to rethink the foundations of people analytics in terms of the data that we process and analyze. And this is where one of my ideas in terms of xMetrics come through, right? There isn't a normal turnover rate within your organization. There isn't a normal engagement rate. What we need to understand, what are the things for each individual that may drive different variances in engagement, in turnover, in collaboration, in performance. Name your metric. We need to understand what are the big drivers of these, and then we need to create predictive models or natural experiments, different ways to do this, but we need to calculate projections based on those critical variables, right? So we need to understand what normal might look for each individual within the organization. Okay. Then once we have that, what we can do is we can compare it to their actual engagement scores, their actual performance scores, their actual turnover rates, and so on to give us personal and contextualized data, right? It's not looking at the organization as a whole and saying, well, where the weirdos are. We need to look at the weirdos and understand why they're not being weird enough. Or we need to look at the middle of that distribution curve, see where people are performing an average, and ask ourselves, who should not be an average performer? Who have we massively invested? Who's in the right position? Why are they not high performers? Or potentially who should be a low performer? They've just joined the organization, for example. They've just had a change in line manager. Why are they actually towards the middle performing pretty well? When we start to ask those questions and build up those data sets, we start to see some really interesting insights. We can also start to analyze across HR, right? This is just a mock-up of a piece of work I've previously done around talent pipeline analysis, right? It's useless comparing people that we've hired through LinkedIn and through recruitment agencies versus, early talent programs, right? They're completely different roles, completely different parts of their sort of career journey, different performance rates as well. But actually, once you start comparing, a trainee versus, hey, what if we just went out and filled this role by someone hiring externally? We start to see actually which talent pipelines are actually overperforming in terms of performance, in terms of engagement, in terms of actual turnover, i.e., the people in these programs are less likely to leave than if we hired off the street, and maybe which some of these programs are underperforming. We can start to ask the questions: do we really want an apprenticeship program if actually they're highly likely to leave, and even if they don't leave, they seem to be incredibly unengaged and they tend to be performing very poorly? Why don't we just bring some? Why we just recruit these externally, or expand our trainee program, right? So once we have the context, we can start asking better questions, not just how is the program doing, but actually it's the opportunity cost. Okay, should we be doing this program versus the alternative option? And it's about creating analytics to understand that alternative option. Now, if you think I have all the answers, I absolutely don't. But I do have lots of fun questions, and I want to explore different topics, like kind of wicked environments. When should we explore versus when should we actually exploit the skills that we have? Look at how we collect data. I think one of the big things that I hear when I talk to people about behavioral economics in people analytics, they think, oh yeah, that's how you influence stakeholders. That's how you make PowerPoint presentations where there's lots of options and people feel like they have a choice and they feel like they're actually involved in the project. I think that's the kind of the front end behavioral economics, but actually I think there's a real what I want to explore as well is when should we use the back end. I've already talked about expected metrics, how we calculate metrics and how we actually put context to them, but also how we measure. How do we measure purpose? Do we just say, hey, are you aligned with the business strategy? Or do we listen to behavioral economics and say, actually, people work here and that they post rationalize reasons? How do we uncover those reasons? And how do we uncover which of those reasons might be under threat, which makes people feel like they need to leave, right? Lastly, I'll talk a little bit about in terms of a preview, but deep dives and shallow dives as well. I think there's some really interesting evidence to say actually we need to stop trying to be right. We need to stop doing these big deep dives where we try and prove things or try and be predictive, and actually maybe we need to be doing a lot more shallow dives where essentially we're not trying to be right, we're trying to be fast, we're trying to be not wrong but kind of interesting and drive conversations. So these are some of the topics I'm going to explore. Once I've explored them all and hopefully get some feedback or have the opportunity to talk to some of you guys, then I'll rewrite and hopefully be able to share with you something that is something that I'm a bit more proud of. Anyway, I will post a link to the dissertation in the comments below, and please do add me on LinkedIn, subscribe on YouTube, and if you don't have anything in your inbox by next week, then please give me some grief because I would like your help in motivating me. Anyway, I've talked for long enough. Thank you for your time, and I hope this wasn't a complete waste of your time.